Good afternoon. Welcome to today's webinar on the subject of R2V3, an overview of the changes between the R2 2013 standard and the R2V3 standard. My name is Austin Matthews. I'm the EHS Program Manager with PJR. Welcome. I have a brief agenda on the screen here. We'll cover a little bit about PJR, some of the benefits of certification to a standard such as R2. We will highlight the transition timeline expectations. We'll spend the bulk of our time covering the changes between the two versions of the standard. So what's different in this revision? What are some of the key things you need to know as you get started planning your transition? And we'll close with a review of the certification process for new clients, and we'll answer any questions you might have at the end as well. So please feel free to type those questions into the chat at any point. I will save them for the end. We are recording today's webinar, and a recording will be available on PJR's website. You'll also be able to access and download a copy of the slides from today's webinar after the webinar concludes, also through PJR's website. Perry Johnson Registrars is one of the leading certification bodies. We have clients certified to a variety of standards around the world. This list of countries certainly is not all-inclusive, but gives an idea of our global presence. As I said, we're able to grant certification for a variety of standards. Today we are talking about R2. PJR is accredited to both R2 2013 and to R2V3. You might recognize some of these other standards to which we're accredited as well. Benefits of certification vary by standard, by industry, by organization, but we can speak to some of the general benefits that apply to at least some of the organizations and standards. Specifically for R2, we're talking about an environmental health and safety standard covering electronic recycling. So some of the benefits include that commitment to responsibly reusing and recycling the electronics and the electronic components, improvements to an organization's environmental health and safety performance as the standard requirements and the management system are implemented and maintained. The standard provides a framework for meeting customer and/or regulatory requirements. It also drives improvements to management commitment and employee engagement levels. In some areas, it can provide a competitive advantage if you are putting in for bids for contracts and you're competing against organizations that don't hold the R2 standard certification or a comparable certification. It could provide that competitive advantage. It could also improve the organization's public image, having the ability to advertise a certification such as R2V3. In addition to the competitive advantage and the improvements to public image we just discussed, which could in and of themselves provide financial benefits, in some areas, insurance premiums may also be lowered as a result of holding management system certifications such as R2 or some of the health and safety standards for which there is an R2V3 prerequisite. Certification to R2V3 can also help an organization achieve strategic objectives and/or stakeholder requirements that they may be subject to. It also allows for the integration of the management system for R2V3 with other business management systems. For clients who are already certified to R2 2013 and are preparing to transition to R2V3, it's important to understand some of the transition information. We'll go through the timeline and the transition deadlines in a moment. The R2V3 standard itself was published and is available on CERI's website. The transition plan was released as a CIRI advisory, and that can be found on CIRI's website as well. The Code of Practice was revised for R2V3 and is found on CIRI's website. And CIRI is also maintaining a knowledge base through their website in lieu of a formal guidance document to provide clarification on different subjects, answer questions, and provide additional detail. As I mentioned, the transition expectations for clients transitioning from R2 2013 to R2V3 are spelled out by CIRI also in an advisory. The transition expectations are staggered in order to give facilities some time to plan, but also to avoid overloading the auditors and the certification bodies with a high volume of clients attempting to transition at the same time. If there was just an overall deadline to transition, most clients would wait until the very end of that period to go ahead and transition. So like I said, there's a staggered approach this time around that CIRI has implemented through their advisory requirements. PJR's transition plan is available on its website. It echoes the requirements of the CIRI advisory transition plan. However, PJR also conveys a recommended internal deadline by which our clients should have their transition audit occur. This is meant to do what we can to prevent a lapse in certification, prevent our clients from transitioning too close to the deadline, the overall deadline. So we have to factor in time for all of the decision-making activities that go on behind the scenes before a certificate can actually be issued. It's not sufficient to have your audit conclude the day before the overall CIRI transition deadline. Otherwise, you won't have a certificate in time and you will have a lapse in certification. So we've identified a preferred deadline of March 30th, 2023 to allow for those activities to take place after the last day of the audit. Things like resolving correct NCRs through the corrective action process and working to submit and obtain approval from your auditor for those corrective action responses. The package also gets a technical review within PJR before having a certificate drafted based on the audit package, which will require the client's approval before a final certificate can be issued. We typically estimate 6 to 8 weeks from the time that your auditor accepts your corrective action responses to any NCRs to when a certificate should be expected to go through those activities. The transition timeline, as I mentioned, is staggered, and it's based specifically on the R2 2013 certificate expiration date for transitioning clients. We're already beyond the point of the first bullet point, which indicates that we're no longer able to conduct new certifications, so stage 1 and stage 2 audits to R2 2013. New certifications at this point are only being offered to the R2V3 standard. So now we're in the part for current and existing R2 2013 clients to transition to R2V3. I mentioned it's based on expiration date. So if your current R2 2013 certificate expires this calendar year, so anytime between now and December 31st of 2021, you're able to recertify to R2 2013 one more time if your audit is finished by this calendar year, by the end of this calendar year. So what that doesn't mean is if you are going to recertify in 2022, that you can recertify early by going in 2021 to recertify to R2 2013. Because again, the transition expectations are based on expiration date. They are not based on audit date. So whether or not your audit takes place in 2021 or 2022, if your certificate expires after December 31st, 2021, you need to transition, at your recertification audit or by the overall deadline. So we have some clients whose expiration date is early of 2022. So to use those as an example, if they're due for their recertification audit in 2021 to get their annual audit accomplished this calendar year, and that is supposed to be a recert, then they'll be transitioning at their 2021 recertification audit. If they have had an audit for 2021 or their 2021 audit is a surveillance audit, but their certificate expires in 2022, then during their 2022 recertification audit, they will be transitioning to R2V3. If your certificate expires in 2023, you can choose to transition at either your 2022 audit or your 2023 audit if it occurs early enough in the year to meet that overall transition deadline. To build off that, clients can transition to R2V3 during any audit within their cycle. However, I do want to make sure you're aware that the transition time calculation is equivalent to both a stage 1 and stage 2 audit. This is to allow for coverage of all the core requirements, as well as all the applicable, the applicable process requirements that go into the transition audit as specified by the SERI transition criteria. The transition audit will also restart the 3-year certification cycle for that particular standard. So if you're not due for a recertification and you're transitioning, you may be out of sync with your other standards moving forward for a time. Again, the overall transition deadline is June 30th, 2023, at which point any untransitioned certificates to R2 2013 will be withdrawn. This is a lot of information. It's found in the PGR transition plan as well as the SERI transition plan, and you can work directly with your scheduler and your salesperson to understand when you're due to transition if you're not already aware. I also have some of this information at a high level in a visual timeline representation. Sometimes that is helpful to see it laid out in a different format. Okay, so we're going to take a step back, talk quickly about why the standard was revised, and then we're going to get into some of those key changes. The R2 2013 standard was revised for a variety of reasons, but we'll talk about a couple really quickly. Certainly, the revisions take into account a variety of lessons learned by SERI and the TAC, the R2 Technical Advisory Committee, based on feedback and public comments and just experience with the audits and the audit packages. It was also revised to reflect the diversity of the industry. So again, that would coincide with some of the feedback they've received over the years for R2 2013, just trying to make sure it applies, the requirements can be applied to a wide range of types of organizations, sizes of organizations, to reflect the diversity of the industry itself. It was also revised to reinforce effective implementation of some of the standard requirements and or ensure the intent of the standard is being achieved. If that wasn't the case, SERI revised some of the verbiage and the TAC revised some of the verbiage in the hopes of making it clearer and more consistent moving forward. Revised to clarify any language issues or sources of confusion, any verbiage that was not as clear as it could have been, or led to ambiguity or different interpretations of the requirements. Standards are typically revised for some of these common reasons: maintaining market relevance, making sure they continue to be compatible with other integrated standards, to ensure ease of use, ease of translation, being flexible for a variety of organizations of different sizes, things like that. At a high level, the key changes in R2V3 are included on this site. This is a very high level overview of the revisions for R2V3. You can certainly find more detailed and more technical information on the SERI website. This is not a paid course. This isn't an R2 auditor training, but we like to give our clients a heads up about some of the key areas or some of the key changes as they begin to get familiar with the standard that has been revised. So I want to emphasize right off the bat that no changes have been made to the intent of the R2 standard. The original intent is still intact. The idea of the standard, excuse me, remains unchanged. We want to reuse as much as possible. We want to repair, repurpose. We want to recycle if that can't be achieved, saving destruction for last. The intent of the original R2 2013 standard is unchanged. This slide reflects some of the key changes that we do see in R2V3. When you look at the table of contents screenshot that I have on the right of the screen, you'll see right away one of the main changes is the division of the standard into two sections. The first half, or the first section, would be the core requirements, and the second are the process requirements. And we'll talk about those as we go through. The core requirements will apply to all organizations pursuing R2V3 certification, while the process requirements, also known as appendices, will be applicable based on an organization's scope. So not all process requirements will apply to all R2V3 organizations. It will depend on the scope of certification, the processes being conducted at the facility, the types of electronics or focus materials managed at the site, things like that. The R2V3 standard has a greater emphasis on reuse. It's more prescriptive in certain areas, including data security and testing. I mentioned earlier one of the reasons the standard was revised was to clarify some requirements which may not have been clear or effectively implemented across the board. There are changes to the order, grouping, and number of provisions. Again, we see them now as core requirements, and there are no longer 13, we see 10. Another key change is the creation of an R2 equipment categorization document, also known as the REC. And some of the process requirements or appendices will now require a certified QMS or quality management system, in addition to the EHS system prerequisites that were already in place in R2 2013. So not all R2V3 organizations will be required to have a certified quality management system, but some will, and this is definitely a change compared to the R2 2013 standard. We're going to go through section by section, but we're not going to cover all of the material. We're just going to focus on the things that are changed significantly. I mentioned the REC. It can be downloaded from CERI's website, and the REC is a document to be used in conjunction with the standard. It's not auditable, but it provides an outline for requirements for evaluating the electronic equipment and components, to be able to categorize their functionality, their cosmetic condition, and other factors. And the use of the REC is required for R2V3 certification. The categories found within the REC can be used directly, or they can be correlated to existing categories that the R2 facility might use through a cross-reference. There are no significant changes to the R2 certification section. The process requirements will be listed on the certificate itself. There are a variety of new or changed definitions. I've included a summary of some of those terms here, not taking the time to go through the definitions. I would highly encourage you to do so, get familiar with some of these new terms so that you can interpret the requirements of the standard more clearly. There are several new terms, for example, R2 controlled streams. Core requirement 1 focuses on scope. It has all of the shalls for the R2 audits and certifications. Some things I want to draw your attention to here are, again, the fact that all of the core requirements will apply, and any applicable process requirements given the scope will also apply. We want to make sure that the certification includes, as required, external processes under the control of the R2 facility and associated with its certification. Services outside of the facility might include off-site collection, mobile data destruction, services performed at a customer site, just to name a few examples. The certificate will include the process requirements, as I indicated earlier. It will also include all legal names and legal entities associated with the certifiable activities operating at or in conjunction with the R2 facility. Another key change in R2V3, or a change worth mentioning here, is the need to communicate a current and ongoing list of all your other locations that are not certified. So if they are not certified to R2, if they're owned and operated by the R2 facility, and they're used to manage used or end-of-life electronic equipment components or materials, this needs to be really clearly communicated. To be eligible for R2V3 certification, you cannot have been identified by SERI within the last 2 years, to have marketed your R2 certification deceptively or fraudulently, participated in illegal acts or activities, etc. SERI is going to utilize a formal deceptive practices list or something of that nature to communicate organizations who would fall under this category and would be prevented from pursuing R2V3 certification at this time. There are no significant changes to Core Requirement 2, which covers the hierarchy of responsible management strategies. As I said, the intent of the standard is the same. Core Requirement 3 covers the EHS management system requirements. It recognizes different standards to fulfill the EHS prerequisite requirement. For those of you who are not aware, ISO 45001 has replaced OSAS 18001, as the 18001 migration deadline has now passed. There are other acceptable EHS standards, and those are described or listed on SERI's website. For example, you could have RIOS to fulfill the EHS requirement, as you could have ISO 14001 and ISO 45001. This has some inaccurate information. I need to make adjustments to the slides, and I will do so before they are posted. But the TL 9001, for example, comes into play when we discuss the QMS requirements later in the slides. The Core Requirement 3, focusing on EHS, also requires a process to periodically evaluate exposures to hazardous substances. Examples include mercury, lead, beryllium, cadmium, PCBs, phosphor compounds, flame retardants, silica dust, and hexchromium. Industrial hygiene monitoring program requirements for high-risk activities such as materials recovery are required through Appendix E. Core Requirement 3 also specifies the minimum accommodations and requirements required for workers, including providing sanitary facilities and controlling or preventing the consumption of food or drinks in areas which are not kept contaminant-free. Core Requirement 4 covers legal and other requirements. There's a requirement in Core Requirement 4 to document the applicable legal requirements for export, transit, and/or import. This is very similar to the requirements of R2 2013. However, we see some new terminology here. As I mentioned earlier, R2 controlled streams is a new term in R2V3 that you'll want to get more familiar with so that you can understand how it's applied in R2V3. R2V3 also clarifies in Core Requirement 4 that the requirements for legality of export apply whether the shipment is made by the R2 facility or by one of its downstream vendors. So not being the organization to ship overseas from your facility doesn't preclude the need to verify the legality of exports happening within your recycling chain. The exception to that would be this line right here that says to final disposition or the first R2 facility, where in the standard we see R2 facility. The R2V3 standard means R2V3 certified facility. So it doesn't recognize R2 2013 certifications. We are talking about R2V3 certified facilities. You can stop this verification at the first or R2V3 certified tier. Otherwise, you have to follow this path, this requirement, all the way through to final disposition, also known as end of life. Core Requirement 4 requires prompt corrective action to address any compliance violations, and also requires the R2 facility notify their certification body if they receive a notice of violation requiring action or follow-up within 30 days of receipt. Child and forced labor is prohibited. Prison labor is prohibited unless workers are compensated beyond room and board and are taught skills to be used to obtain employment upon release. Excuse me. It also specifies non-discrimination policy requirements and criteria within Core Requirement 4. Core Requirement 5 covers tracking throughput, requires a summary report be maintained for all inbound and outbound transactions controlled by the R2 facility. It specifies the required contents of those records, such as accurate dates, detailed descriptions for all of those inbound and outbound materials. Core Requirement 5 also specifies that total inventory levels must be maintained below any limits required for conformity with applicable legal requirements and the R2 facility's closure plan. R2 controlled streams, which is a defined term in the standard, as well as materials with a negative value, cannot be stored for more than 1 year. The subject of negative value is also new to R2V3, and it's explored in more detail on Series website within their knowledge base. The exceptions to this 1-year rule include components that have been evaluated and inventoried through Appendix C for test and repair, as well as items that are stored beyond the 1-year limit due only to a lack of response from the governing authority to be able to get approval to export those materials if and when the authorization applications were submitted on time. So if you submitted your permit application for export by the deadline and you haven't gotten a response or that approval and you're storing it until you do, that would be an acceptable exception to the 1-year limit. Core Requirement 6 focuses on sorting, categorization, and processing. You'll notice that this section is significantly restructured compared to R2 2013. There are a number of references in this section to the R2 equipment categorization document. This section also requires a documented process for evaluating, sorting, and categorizing the controlled and processed materials with some prescriptive requirements found within this section. To reiterate, Core Requirement 6, as with all the other core requirements, apply to all R2V3 organizations. So Core Requirement 6 houses the requirements that all R2V3 facilities need to meet. Whether or not they have Appendix C for test and repair, they're still subject to the requirements of Core Requirement 6. It continues on to talk about the need to manage and process all materials as R2 controlled streams, unless proven otherwise through a variety of means. All equipment or components are also to be evaluated for data with their corresponding status identified per the requirements of the REC, specifically speaking to that data status. Core Requirement 6 requires those data evaluations to include any connected user accounts and services. Any equipment or components that might contain data need to be controlled per Core Requirement 7. Equipment or components not permitted for reuse through written contracts are still subject to Core Requirement 7 and Appendix E. Identification requirements for equipment or components evaluated and found to be capable of reuse are found within Core Requirement 6, as well as references to applicable appendix requirements that might also apply. Core Requirement 6 also houses specific requirements for electronics and components that have been evaluated and categorized as an unrestricted stream, such as handling them separately from R2 controlled streams. There are also specific requirements for transferring functioning products. There's labeling requirements. Although labels are not necessarily required, there can be other methods of tracking or identification. And the collectible and specialty electronics requirements are very similar to those of R2 2013. Core Requirement 7 focuses on data security. It requires a data sanitization plan to be maintained with procedures to address subjects prescribed within the standard. Again, I want to reiterate here that all of the core requirements apply, whether or not you have certain appendices. So while Appendix B focuses on data sanitization and may apply given your scope, Data Security Core Requirement 7 applies to all R2V3 organizations. So even if you are not putting those data sanitization terms in your scope or focusing on that as a process, you still need to meet the requirements of Core Requirement 7 to be eligible for R2V3, which means you will need, for example, a data sanitization plan. There are also requirements for a written data security policy, including assigning a competent data protection representative, the need to consider risk of theft and unauthorized access within the security program, levels of security permissions for controlled access, written acknowledgements for those granted security authorizations, an incident response procedure for investigating potential or actual security breaches, and a process to demonstrate 100% effectiveness of destruction processes. Devices can be shipped or transferred for data destruction to a downstream vendor if they've been verified according to Appendix A. So this is where, as I was saying, even if you're not going to have Appendix B for data sanitization, you still need to meet the requirements of Core Requirement 7. So if you're outsourcing the data sanitization rather than applying Appendix B to your organization, the requirements of Appendix A would apply in how you have vetted or verified your downstream vendor to whom you are outsourcing those sanitization and or destruction requirements. Core Requirement 7 also requires annual internal data security and sanitization audits to validate the data sanitization processes be performed by a competent and independent auditor. There's a requirement for providing information to suppliers upon request, including changes to their downstream vendors and security breaches. Core Requirement 8 focuses on focus materials. It includes the requirement to demonstrate the recycling chain's expertise and capabilities, have a downstream recycling chain flowchart when you're not the final point of processing or end of life, and this ties into Appendix A requirements. It notes that alkaline batteries not containing mercury would not be considered focus materials under the R2V3 standard and would instead be managed under Core Requirement 2 along with print cartridges. Conversely, in R2V3, circuit boards, regardless of their lead content, are all considered focus materials. Core Requirement 9 houses the facility requirements. Indoor processing is required except in instances where outdoor operations have been assessed for risk and release potentials controlled. It requires indoor storage and labeling unless the products are intended for outdoor use. It dictates the appropriateness of insurance coverage given the risk, size, and scope of operations, and this needs to be maintained up to date to reflect changes in operations, processing volumes, things like that. The closure plan is to include the use of appropriate commercial businesses to manage any electronics left under their control. R2V3 has an exception for the requirement to hold a financial instrument for closure costs in instances where an R2V3 facility meets all three of these bullet points. So the total closure costs have to be less than $10,000 US. The size of the building has to be less than 1,000 square meters, and the R2 facility is never allowed to accept equipment or materials containing mercury, CRT glass, lithium primary batteries, or polychlorinated biphenyls. The last core requirement, Core Requirement 10, covers transport. The need to package the products or materials securely for transportation per Core Requirement 7 and in compliance with Core Requirement 4. There are additional requirements if you're transporting data containing media, such as additional security measures and tracking. Core Requirement 10 also requires the accuracy of codes, descriptions, and declarations for those shipping documents and labels. So those are the 10 core requirements that apply to all R2V3 facilities. The second section, the process requirements, on the other hand, also known as the appendices, apply based on your scope of operations, your processes, and the types of materials. What exactly you do will dictate which appendices apply. Appendix A covers downstream recycling, or the downstream recycling chain. It outlines the focus material plan, the due diligence requirements, the verification of import and export legality. It requires the R2 facility track and demonstrate the recycling chain to final disposition or to register the managed portion with SERI. It also requires transparent communication regarding the recycling chain to its suppliers. For an R2V3 certified downstream vendor, verification of a valid R2 certificate will satisfy the due diligence requirements. So again, in the standard, when we see references to an R2 facility, we are strictly recognizing R2V3. The R2V3 standard will not accept an R2 2013 certificate. If your downstream vendor is R2 2013 certified, that's fine, that's great, but they would fall under this non-R2V3 downstream vendor category. I have this a little bit clearer in my slides than it is in the standard. The Appendix A states R2 certified or R2 facility and non-R2. And I just really want to be clear that those non-R2 would include the R2 2013 vendors. This is a difficult concept as we have seen for our clients so far. They struggle to accept or understand how a client or a tier 1 or whoever with an R2 2013 certificate would not fulfill the certification requirements and be allowed the leaner qualification evidence that would be in the first of the 2 bullet points on this screen. As I mentioned earlier, if the data sanitization is being outsourced to the downstream vendor, there's additional due diligence that would be found in Appendix A, and this would be in Section 8D. Appendix B covers data sanitization. It could be provided to an organization who is doing logical sanitization, physical sanitization, or both. And audit time is based on those subcategories of the process requirement. Before I move on, I'm actually going to back up one step here to Appendix A. Audit time is additive for each of the process requirements to be able to have that process in your scope. For Appendix A, time is calculated based on the number of downstream vendors you have. There are a couple of brackets for the audit time to be calculated, and those are found in the Code of Practice. Similarly, Appendix B, the audit time will be based on whether you do logical sanitization, physical sanitization, or both. The audit time will be calculated accordingly. If you do none of those things, if you are not meeting the requirements of the appendix, not claiming that process in your scope, and you're outsourcing that instead, we would not apply Appendix B. Appendix B houses all of the additional requirements for data sanitization above and beyond those found in Core Requirement 7 for everyone to meet. There are an extensive number of differences: traceability, training, security controls, physical destruction methods, video recordings of physical destruction, software requirements for data sanitization, criteria for a specific sample size, corrective action expectations for non-conforming product, additional requirements for the data protection representative to approve devices for release. There's a variety of requirements. Those are just a couple examples. Appendix C covers test and repair. Again, we need to understand whether you'll be doing, excuse me, let me grab a drink. We'll need to understand whether your organization is conducting testing or repair or both, excuse me. R2 facilities certifying to Appendix C are also required to have a quality management system certification. So I mentioned this briefly earlier. It could include a variety of standards. There are a couple listed on Siri's website that are allowed. I will update my slides. Until recently, these were specifically ISO 9001 or RIOS. There have been a couple more added recently, such as TL 9000. So I'll get these slides updated before they are shared to PGR's website for your reference. But those standards are accessible through Siri's website to see all of the options for fulfilling that quality management system requirement if you're applying Appendix C. Appendix C is not the only appendix that requires a QMS, but I wanted to describe that in detail since this is the first one we've encountered. Appendix C also requires a written R2 reuse plan. There's prescriptive criteria of what needs to be included. There's the need to process materials within 1 year of receipt, to test, to ensure that the test result records are maintained for each functionality for each item. There's a whole host of other requirements in Appendix C. Appendix D covers specialty electronics reuse. For an organization to apply Appendix D, they must also have Appendix C, which means they'll also need a quality management system. There are detailed criteria and verification requirements for specialty electronics in Appendix D in lieu of testing, since the R2 facility would lack the technical capability to test those specialty electronics. There are categories for failing and passing and associated requirements for those verified specialty electronics. There's references to utilize the rec again in Appendix D. Need to make sure there continues to be a reuse market to be able to keep storing those specialty electronics indefinitely. We need unique identifiers or part numbers for those sales receipts and records, and the ability to demonstrate that the customer accepts the terms in Appendix D, such as a lack of testing, and obviously the requirement for a return policy. Appendix E covers materials recovery. These are significant and additional EHS requirements above and beyond those found in Core Requirement 3 for R2 facilities performing materials recovery activities or destructive dismantling. This is another area where you can get some clarification on Series website. There is even a scope determination tool on Series website that breaks down each of the appendices to help an organization understand if it does or does not apply given their scope of work and their processes. Appendix E houses, like I said, a lot of additional EHS requirements such as industrial hygiene criteria, hazard and risk assessment, maintenance, pollution liability insurance. Let's see. And again, these are only to be applied if your organization is conducting materials recovery or destructive dismantling. This would not be applied in instances where material is dismantled to a limited degree to retrieve reusable components or harvest reusable parts to break, to dismantle to a degree. So the scope tool on Series website is really helpful in providing some examples or asking certain types of questions to put yourself in either the category that requires Appendix E or the category that does not. And I think you'll find that helpful. Appendix F is the last appendix. This covers brokering. It applies both to situations where the material is being directly delivered from the supplier to the downstream vendor, or coming through the broker's facility but not being processed. Perhaps it's being aggregated and shipped then from the broker. The R2 facilities carrying the process requirement for Appendix F also need a quality management system certification such as ISO 9001, RIOS, etc. And again, that list is on Series website as well. Brokers are still required to manage their downstream vendors according to Appendix A. They're still responsible for Core Requirement 4, utilizing the REC, data security and transport for Core Requirement 10, tracking Core Requirement 5. The requirements that would not apply in some instances with certain types of brokers would be Core Requirements 3 and 9. So if the broker doesn't have a facility that takes physical possession of the materials and they never physically enter a warehouse to be aggregated and then eventually shipped out by the broker, then we wouldn't need a certified EHS management system. We would not need to verify Core Requirement 3, nor would we be looking for the requirements of Core Requirement 9, such as insurance for the facility and coverage of closure costs, because again, those electronics would never be entering the broker's facility. I'm not going to go through the REC in detail. I just want to point out that again, while it's not auditable, it is a document that's required to be used by R2V3 facilities. It provides a framework for evaluating electronic equipment, components, and materials, and categorizing their R2 status. There are categories for cosmetic condition, functional condition, and data sanitization status. Categories from the rec should be recognized by other R2V3 facilities. And while it would be preferred that you use the exact categories in the rec, a cross-reference is also acceptable. I have some screenshots and some examples from the contents of the rec, but again, we're not going to focus on that in today's webinar. I just want to show this first table in the rec, the R2 applicability table. It makes some distinctions between the R2 controlled streams and the unrestricted streams to understand the applicable requirements and or the next processing steps. So I mentioned there's a lot of different categories: cosmetic, functionality, data sanitization status, and requirements for use. The Code of Practice is another good source of information. It covers some of the other key changes that our customers or clients are impacted by, such as the need to do a contract or readiness review before a stage 1 or transition audit. At PJR, we're calling this process the contract validation. It's done off-site before that stage 1 or transition audit, and you need to fulfill all of those requirements detailed within the Code of Practice to be able to finish or pass the contract validation for your audit to go as scheduled. It's really to confirm eligibility for R2V3 certification and to avoid significant issues once the audit begins. The Code of Practice made a number of changes to the certification structure. Some of the terminology we use to classify site schemes. It allows up to one R2V3 surveillance audit be conducted virtually per 3-year cycle. It specifies deadlines for NCR closure through corrections, revisits, things like that. It requires a revisit for all R2V3 NCRs. Those can be virtual or on-site, but whether they're minor or major, it does require a revisit for R2V3. And there are currently no allowances for R2V3, although they may potentially add some in the future. It's there as a placeholder. I want to briefly provide an overview of the certification steps for any clients who are pursuing certification to R2V3 for the first time rather than transitioning from R2 2013 to R2V3. You'll need to download the standard and establish your EHS documentation for your management system. You'll need to conduct any required training and implement those requirements, including having an internal audit, a compliance evaluation, and a management system review. You'll need a contract with a certification body such as PJR to conduct those audits, and you'll need to submit any pre-qualification information required for that contract validation I discussed earlier. Once that's successfully completed, you'll have your stage 1 and stage 2 audits, address any resulting nonconformities before a certificate can be issued. Again, we're looking at 6 to 8 weeks from approval of those nonconformities and corrective action plans to getting a certificate. The contract validation step I mentioned is off-site. For stage 1 clients, it's half a day, and for transition clients, it can be as little as a quarter day. Stage 1 audits take place after that. It's a document review and a preliminary review. The first part of your audit, your registration audit, evaluates the readiness of your organization to have the stage 2 audit. It may identify NCRs, and those need to be resolved or corrected before the stage 2 can even take place. The stage 2 audit, on the other hand, covers the entire system, all of the requirements of the standard. The stage 2 time for R2V3 is required to be on site. If nonconformities are identified, they need to be resolved before a certificate can be issued. And as I mentioned earlier, they will also require a revisit. Certificates are good for 3 years. Once you obtain your certificate, you're in your surveillance cycle. You have annual or semi-annual audits depending on your contract. And those surveillance audits, those next 2 years, are partial system audits. They won't be as long. They won't cover all of the core requirements and process requirements. It will be a sampling based on the auditing requirements of the Code of Practice. The following year, the third year, will be a recertification audit, which is very similar to the stage 2 in that we cover all of the requirements of the standard, sample all the shifts, all the requirements, address any NCRs before a certificate is issued, and the certification cycle starts again. If you have not already done so, feel free to type any questions you might have, and I will review them now. I want to share my contact information should you have the need to discuss something offline. Again, my name is Austin Matthews. I have the PJR number and my direct email address. You can call and be put through to my extension, or you could send me an email. I've also included the phone number for the sales department if you're a new client looking for a quote or to get that process started. And again, if you are a client transitioning from R2 2013 to R2V3, I highly encourage you to reach out to your scheduler to talk through your transition requirements if you have not already done so. One question we have is looking for an example of a financial instrument for the closure plan. So again, my answer to a lot of these questions will relate to the CRE website, which houses a lot of technical information and further explanation of the requirements of the standard. It's possible that the standard verbiage lists some examples. I don't remember off the top of my head, but this is an area that's similar to R2 2013 in that financial instruments can be met by a variety of ways. We have seen some clients utilize a line of credit. We've seen some clients utilize their owned equipment by having them legally bound to the closure cost expenses. So you would need evidence of whatever type of financial instrument you decide on. You need to be able to show that that's been done, that those equipment you're referencing are owned by the organization and are legally bound to that purpose, or show a copy of that line of credit or evidence of that line of credit being in place and valid. There are a number of ways that that financial instrument requirement can be met. We have a question about transition deadlines. If your certificate expires in 2023, to reiterate what I said earlier, you can either choose to transition early by going for your transition in 2022, or you can transition in 2023 with the understanding that your audit needs to take place in enough time to allow for no lapse in certification. So that's where our recommended deadline of March 30th comes into play. We recommend having your audit no later than March 30th of that year if you're transitioning then, to allow for the corrective actions to be closed, the package to be reviewed, and not have a lapse in certification. So if you want to send me an email, we can pull up your profile specifically, or you can talk to your scheduler. I'll answer that with a caveat that you, of course, need to meet all of the other requirements. So assuming you've had an audit every year, assuming you're due for just a surveillance audit in 2022 and your recertification in 2023, then yes, you could transition in 2023 as long as you're keeping an eye on that transition deadline to avoid a lapse. There's a question about the requirement for tracking to end of life for downstream vendors. If you're using an R2V3 certified vendor, can I stop there? There's a couple different requirements in Appendix A, and I would encourage you to review CRE's website for this one as well. There is a section in Appendix A about tracking or transparency, and there's also a requirement, a separate subsection about verifying your downstream vendors. So one specifically allows you to stop at the first R2V3 vendor, the other does not. So I would take a close look at the verbiage in the standard and review Siri's website. There's also information in Appendix A about registering your flow in lieu of the need to have the transparent tracking. But again, there are two separate subsections, so take a look at that verbiage closely. Okay, that appears to be all of the questions for today. So as I mentioned, I will make a couple of tweaks to my slides based on changes I noticed as I was going through them today, and I will change them before the slides are published. One more question came through about registering the flow. Information about that should be provided by Siri through the license agreement. I think you're given a key, a registration key. The flow registration is managed through Siri, so you would go directly through Siri to register the downstream flow. A recording of the webinar will be made available on PJR's website. I can be contacted by email if you have technical questions you'd like to discuss offline. And I'm also offering these webinars. I try to offer them once a month. So feel free to review the Siri website, tune back in for a future webinar if you have additional questions. If you're preparing for your transition audit, best of luck. And if you're new to R2V3, good luck during your audit. I hope that the slides are helpful in providing just a high-level overview of some of those key changes. There are several changes within the standard, but as I mentioned, between the webinar and Siri's website, there is a lot of resources and information available to help you prepare for your R2V3 audit. Thanks for joining us and have a great day.